Confederate General Patrick Cleburne wanted to utilize slaves in the early part of the war, but was turned down by the Confederate Congress. Not until March of 1864 did President Jefferson Davis, along with Robert E. Lee, convince the Confederate Congress to officially muster in black troops. These troops would never see battle. Lee would surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. No other event in our history has defined the American Constitution or our government than the American Civil War. With the American Revolution, we the people declared that all free-thinking men shall be self-governed. With the spirit of 1776, we give definition to a people who agreed to self-government. Out of the ashes of the American Civil War arose the encompassment of a strong, centered government. We now brought definition to our government, but not without a tremendous cost to our nation. Well over 600,000 Americans of North and South gave their last measure for the birth of this new nation.
Many slaves throughout the South felt an allegiance to their slave owners, particularly in the instance where they were not beaten every day. Many slaves came to accept slavery as their fate, as a way of life.
It is a factor that has been made up note of that very few Southerners actually owned slaves. Most Southerners did not.
People are doing what they have to do. They are sometimes doing what they want to do, and they are doing what they were forced to do. Many of those who are working in the Confederacy are slaves who were laborers. Many others who are in the Confederacy are there with their slaveholders who are also their relatives. Their Union Army may be very far away, and it will be completely out of the question for them to be able to safely escape to it.
So they lived a comparative in a comparative status. The slaves at the plantation down the road were beaten regularly and what have you. They were not adventuresome in many instances to the extent that they were willing to run away and face the unknowns of what was waiting for them 100 miles away or 50 miles away. And then family liaisons suggested that many slaves did not leave. But I think that there are numerous psychological studies taking place whereas individuals become to a certain extent dependent on their oppressors. And I would have to think that this was probably, not being a psychologist of course, but I would have to think that this is probably the motivation for forest slaves remaining both during the war and even after the war, as has been indicated by others, until their deaths.
Why do these men support the forces defending slavery? It seems today that the complexity of African American life in the Confederate and pre-Confederate South has been lost in the singular issue of slavery. But, in fact, slavery, while certainly dominated by the white race, was not their sole domain. Native Americans and African American freedmen also owned slaves. In the year preceding the war, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina alone, there existed no less than 120 black freedmen who owned at least one slave. Several black slave owners wrote jointly to the New Orleans Daily Delta in December 1860.
Many places throughout the Deep South, the older parts where the larger plantations existed, also witnessed the existence of blacks owning other blacks. A number of blacks who had been manumitted or had earned enough money to purchase their own freedom became entrepreneurs, purchased or acquired land, and in turn became slave owners and went into cotton, indigo, or rice farming.
Well, I think that most people, when they hear that there were blacks who fought in the Confederacy, they are outraged because they think that these fighters were forced to fight. In some instances they probably were. It's very hard for people today to accept the fact that a black could volunteer for Confederate service because he felt some kind of patriotism towards the South, that he felt loyalty towards a master, or that he wanted to prove to the establishment that he was deserving of eventually receiving his freedom. what many Americans forget is that there were 5,000 black soldiers who fought with George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And of course, in 1812, Andrew Jackson, who praised the blacks in his service profusely, also knew that those blacks were taking a risk fighting for the United States government. So if blacks can fight for George Washington, it's hard for me to reject the idea that their grandsons could not have fought for Robert E. Lee. And of course, remember, they had practical considerations. Many of them, they only knew the South. And many of the blacks who were in the Confederate forces, most of the blacks were more useful to the Confederate Army or to the Confederate government as civilians as opposed to being soldiers or sailors. Many of these blacks were taking the chance of saying, look, I'm going to show you that I'm a patriot, and I hope to be rewarded as a consequence of it. These are very practical considerations. I think the problem that we have today is most Americans have a difficult time accepting the past because we read into the past the prejudices of the present. The moment you do that, you're not dealing with history. I mean, history, I've often said to my students, is like taking a bath in muddy water. You're never going to be completely clean. And you have to see the past as the past was, not the way we wish it was.